In 1941, a train full of soldiers vanished in the middle of World War II. For 70 years, their families believed a simple story: they were lost at sea. But when a woman cleaning out her late father's attic found a hidden letter, a single sentence revealed that official story was a lie. The military records insisted the train arrived safely. So where were all the men? Her search for answers led her to a secret map and a forgotten rail line that ended abruptly at an abandoned coal mine, and put her in the path of powerful people who warned her that some secrets must stay buried. Why, after 7 decades, was the truth about what really happened to that train still a secret worth protecting? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The dust in the attic wasn't just dust. To Margaret Hale, at 62 years old, it was the settled, powdery residue of a life fully lived and a family history mostly forgotten. It was the dust of her father's 8 decades on this earth, now contained in cardboard boxes and sealed wooden trunks. Each mote that danced in the single beam of light from the dormer window was a ghost of a memory. She was now tasked with sorting, keeping, or letting go. The air was thick and still, smelling of old paper, cedar, and time itself. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the dying leaves of the oak tree her father had planted as a young man, but up here, under the slope of the roof, there was only silence. A deep, heavy silence that felt like a weight on her shoulders. Her husband, John, had been gone for 2 years, and now her father gone for 6 months. The silence was becoming her most constant companion. She moved slowly, methodically, the way a retired schoolteacher does. A box labeled war letters held correspondence from her father to her mother, filled with longing and the mundane details of life on a naval base in the Pacific. Another, school records, held her own perfect attendance certificates and her brother's less-than-stellar report cards. It was all so normal, so expected, and then she saw it. Tucked away on a small, dusty shelf behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines was her family's Bible. It wasn't the ornate, leather-bound heirloom kept downstairs on the mantelpiece. This one was smaller, worn smooth at the edges from travel, its simple black cover softened to a dark gray. This was the Bible her grandmother had given her father when he first left home. Margaret's fingers, stiff with a touch of arthritis, traced the faded gold lettering on the spine. It felt strangely heavy in her hands, heavier than just paper and leather ought to feel. She sat down on an old overturned crate, the wood groaning under her weight, and opened the book. The pages were thin as whispers, the inside covers filled with a spidery script detailing births and deaths in the Hale family tree. Her own name was there, Margaret Ann Hale, born 1949. And above it, a name she knew more as a ghost than as a person. Walter Hale, born 1922. Her father's younger brother, Uncle Walter. The story, the one she'd been told since she was a little girl, was as simple as it was tragic. He had enlisted at 19, a brave young man eager to do his part. His transport ship, they said, had been torpedoed in the Atlantic. He was lost at sea, a hero swallowed by the cold, dark water, his body never recovered. It was a clean, honorable tragedy, a story sealed and put away, like a photograph in a locked drawer. But as she gently turned the pages of the Old Testament, something slipped from between the brittle leaves of Isaiah. It wasn't a photograph or a pressed flower. It was a letter, folded into a tight, small square. The paper was yellowed and fragile, threatening to crumble at her touch. Carefully, she unfolded it. The handwriting was her father's, but it was the rushed, slanted script of his youth, not the careful, steady hand she remembered from the notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter. The letter was dated August 1941, a few months before Pearl Harbor, before America had even officially entered the war. It was addressed to his mother, her grandmother. It spoke of camp, of the endless drills, of the food, normal things. But then, one sentence, near the end, snagged in her mind like a fishhook. It was hard watching the train pull away. We stood on the platform for a long time after. It was the last sight of the boys before the tunnel. Margaret read the line again, and again. The words didn't make sense. Tunnel? Train? The story was the sea, a ship, a torpedo in the vast, empty ocean. There was no train in the story. There was no tunnel. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. This wasn't just an old letter. It was an anomaly, a crack in the foundation of a 70-year-old story. This was something that didn't belong. A surge of energy, sharp and electric, shot through her. It was the first thing she had felt besides grief and exhaustion in months. This was a mystery. Her uncle, the brave boy lost at sea, was suddenly a question mark. She carefully folded the letter, slipped it into her pocket, and left the rest of the boxes for another day. The dust could wait. The ghosts, it seemed, were starting to speak. That evening, her son, Ethan, came over for their weekly dinner. He was a good son, practical and steady, the owner of a local contracting business who always knew how to fix a leaky faucet or a broken step. He had his father's hands and his mother's worry. As she served him the pot roast, she felt a tremor of nervous excitement. She waited until he had taken a few bites before she slid the letter, now protected in a plastic sleeve, across the oak table. "I found this in the attic today," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "In Grandpa's old Bible." Ethan wiped his mouth and picked it up, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. She watched his face, searching for the same spark of intrigue she had felt, but his expression didn't change. He read it once, then twice, before placing it carefully back on the table. "Okay," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "It's an old letter, Mom." "Read the last part, Ethan," she urged, leaning forward. "About the train." "About the tunnel. That's not the story. Uncle Walter was lost at sea." A look of deep weariness settled over her son's features. It was a look she'd come to dread, the look that said he was worried she was becoming fragile. "Mom, it's been 70 years. Grandpa was writing about something else. Maybe a different group of boys. Memory gets mixed up, you know that." "No," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "This was dated August of 41. Walter enlisted in June. It was his company, I'm sure of it." "He's talking about Walter." She saw the protective walls go up in his eyes. "And what if he was?" Ethan asked, his tone gentle but firm. "What does it change? It was a long time ago. A lot of things got confused in the war. Stirring all this up now, what's the point? It will only bring up old grief." His words were meant to be kind, but they felt like a dismissal, a pat on the head. He saw her as a lonely widow looking for a project, not as a keeper of her family's truth. Anger, cold and sharp, pricked at her. "The point," she said, her voice dangerously level, "is the truth. The point is that our family has been telling a story that might be a lie. Doesn't that matter to you?" "What matters to me is you," he shot back, his fork clattering against his plate. "I don't want to see you go down some rabbit hole chasing a ghost story from a 70-year-old letter. It's not healthy. Let the dead rest, Mom. Please." The gulf between them suddenly felt miles wide. He saw a problem to be managed. She saw a duty to be fulfilled. The rest of the dinner passed in a strained, painful silence, the uneaten food on their plates growing cold. When Ethan stood to leave, he hugged her tightly, a hug that felt more like an apology and a warning than one of affection. "Just be careful, okay?" he whispered. "Don't get carried away." After the front door clicked shut, Margaret stood alone in her quiet kitchen, the silence rushing back in to fill the space her son had occupied. For a moment his words echoed in her ears, planting seeds of doubt. Was he right? Was she a foolish old woman chasing shadows? She looked at the letter still lying on the table, the faded ink a testament to a moment frozen in time. She thought of Uncle Walter, the 19-year-old boy whose face she only knew from a single black-and-white photograph, a boy who went to war and simply vanished. Vanished into one story, while another, untold, lay hidden in a Bible for nearly a century. The doubt receded, replaced by a steely resolve that settled deep in her bones. This wasn't about stirring up grief. This was about bringing a lost soldier home. Her son was wrong. Some secrets weren't meant to rest. They were meant to be found. Standing there, under the hum of the refrigerator, Margaret Hale made a quiet vow to the ghost in the attic and the boy in the photograph. "I won't let you stay lost," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise." The promise she made to her uncle's ghost echoed in the morning light, cutting through the fog of her grief with a clean, sharp edge. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret Hale woke up with a purpose that wasn't about simply getting through the day. It was a mission, a thread to be pulled, and she felt a flicker of the determined young woman she used to be before life had softened her edges and loss had worn her down. Her son Ethan's worried voice still lingered in her mind, a cautioning whisper, but it was drowned out by a louder, older call, the call of family, of truth. She knew she couldn't start with the military. That would be a fortress of red tape. She had to start smaller, local. She needed to understand the landscape of 1941. She needed to find that tunnel. The town's historical society was housed in the old Carnegie Library, a grand but slightly crumbling stone building that smelled of decaying paper and lemon polish. It was a place of quiet reverence, where the past was catalogued in manila folders and stored on silent shelves. Margaret had always loved it here. As a teacher, she'd brought generations of students to these rooms to teach them that history wasn't just dates in a book, it was the story of their own grandparents, their own streets. But today, she wasn't a teacher. She was a detective. Behind a large oak desk sat a man who seemed to be a permanent fixture of the place, surrounded by stacks of books and meticulously labeled boxes. He was younger than her, perhaps in his late 50s, with a soft, kind face and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as she approached, his expression patient and welcoming. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice as gentle as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. "I hope so," Margaret began, her voice steady. "My name is Margaret Hale. I'm looking for information about the local rail lines during World War II. Specifically, any temporary routes or changes made around August of 1941. The man's eyes lit up with a genuine spark of interest. This was clearly his world. "That's a very specific request," he said, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He stood and offered a hand. "Sam Weller. I'm a volunteer here. Rail history is my passion. My grandfather worked on these lines before he shipped out." A jolt went through Margaret. It wasn't just a shared interest, it was a shared history. She felt an immediate, unspoken kinship with this quiet man. This was the ally she hadn't even known she was searching for. She showed him her father's letter. He handled the fragile paper with the care of a surgeon, his eyes scanning the faded script. When he reached the last line, he read it aloud softly, "The last sight of the boys before the tunnel." He looked up at her, his expression serious. There's only one major tunnel in this region that was operational back then, but it was on the main passenger line. Military transports used the industrial freight lines to the east to avoid disrupting civilian travel. He led her to a cavernous back room filled with flat file cabinets. For the next hour, they became partners in a treasure hunt through time. They pulled out schematics, transit schedules, and municipal plans. It was a frustrating, fruitless search. Every official map showed the same standard routes, none of which corresponded to her father's vague reference. Margaret's initial surge of hope began to wane, replaced by a familiar sense of disappointment. Maybe Ethan had been right. Maybe it was just a scrambled memory, a meaningless phrase. Just as she was about to suggest they give up, Sam paused, tapping a thoughtful finger on his chin. "Wait a minute," he murmured, more to himself than to her. There was a collection of survey maps donated by the old coal company in the 50s. They were never properly catalogued because they weren't official county records. "Let me check." He disappeared behind a towering shelf and returned a few minutes later, carefully carrying a large, rolled-up canvas. He spread it across a wide table, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was a rail map, but a different kind. Faded and stained, it was a working document, not a published one. And there, branching off from the main freight line just south of the old depot, was a single, faint line drawn in pencil. It snaked its way through the hills for several miles, a route that didn't exist on any other map they had seen. It was a ghost line, a temporary track. And it ended, abruptly, at a location marked with a small hand-drawn symbol and 2 words, "Blackwood Mine." Margaret felt a dizzying sense of triumph. Her hands trembled as she traced the penciled-in route. It was real. The letter was real. "This is it," she whispered, a wave of emotion making her voice thick. This has to be it. This was her high, a peak of discovery so pure and powerful it felt like she could solve anything. Sam's expression was a mixture of excitement and scholarly caution. "We need to be sure," he said. "If a military transport train used this route, there must be a record somewhere. Let's check the official dispatches." He moved to a microfiche machine in the corner of the room, a relic of another era. He carefully threaded a spool of film containing declassified transport records from the summer of 1941. He knew the regimental numbers for the units that had trained at the nearby base. After several minutes of scrolling through blurry documents, he found it. Troop Train 734. The manifest listed 216 soldiers, all from the 10th Infantry Division. Their departure was logged at 0600 hours on August 12, 1941. Margaret held her breath, leaning in so close she could feel the heat from the machine's lamp on her cheek. And then she saw it. The final entry, stamped in bold official ink next to the train's designation, her moment of triumph shattered into a million pieces. The words on the screen were stark and unambiguous. "Arrived safely. Depot 7, August 12, 1940, 1700 hours." A cold dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. Depot 7 was over 50 miles in the opposite direction of the Blackwood mine. It was on the main, official line. The record was a dead end. No, it was worse than a dead end. It was a contradiction, a lie staring her in the face. How could this be? How could a train arrive safely at its destination when her father had watched it go into a tunnel it never should have been near? The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. This is impossible," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "It can't be both." Sam switched off the machine, the bright screen going dark, plunging them back into the room's shadowy quiet. His face was grim. "You're right," he said slowly, the implications dawning on him. "It can't be both. Which means one of two things happened. Either this official record was forged, or that wasn't the original train." The mystery deepened, twisting into something far more sinister than a forgotten accident. This wasn't just about finding a lost train anymore. It was about uncovering a deliberate, 70-year-old deception. They decided their next and only step was to go to the source, the Regional Rail Authority. Their modern headquarters was a sterile glass and steel building that felt a world away from the warm, dusty comfort of the Historical Society. The air inside was cool and smelled of nothing. They were met with polite indifference by a young man at the front desk whose name tag read Kyle. Margaret explained, calmly and clearly, that they were doing historical research and needed access to the operational archives, specifically the internal dispatch logs, for the week of August 10th through the 15th, 1941. Kyle stared at them with a blank expression, tapping on his computer keyboard. "That's a pretty old request," he said, his tone suggesting they were an inconvenience. "I'll have to check with my supervisor." He disappeared into a back office. When he returned, his posture was different. He stood straighter, and he wouldn't meet their eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "We are unable to grant you access to those files." Margaret's heart sank. "Why not?" she pressed, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "They're public records, aren't they?" Kyle swallowed, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. He glanced nervously toward the office he had just left. "The archives for that specific time period are sealed." "Sealed?" Sam interjected, his quiet demeanor hardening. "On what grounds? The war has been over for nearly 70 years. The young man took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and delivered the final crushing blow. The words he spoke were so outrageous, so utterly absurd, that for a moment Margaret thought she had misheard him. He said, "They're still under a national security classification. National security." The phrase hung in the sterile air between them, an iron gate slamming shut in their faces. It was a preposterous lie, a shield of bureaucratic nonsense designed to stop them cold. As they walked out of the building and back into the afternoon sun, the hope that had burned so brightly that morning had been extinguished. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a fortress. And somewhere, inside, someone was still standing guard, determined to keep the truth about Troop Train 734 and the 216 men on board buried forever. The question was no longer just what had happened. It was who was still so desperate to keep it hidden. The words, "national security," were a door slammed shut, a wall of granite erected between Margaret Hale and the truth. For 2 days, the phrase echoed in her mind, a mocking, bureaucratic checkmate. It was a lie, and she knew it. It was a lie designed to make a person feel small, powerless, and foolish for even asking. A lesser person would have stopped, intimidated by the weight of that official, impenetrable term. But Margaret was a teacher. She had spent a lifetime dealing with obstinate children and stubborn school boards. She knew that when the front door is locked, you look for a window, and if the windows are barred, you find someone who still has a key to the back door. She called Sam Weller, her voice laced with a frustration that had hardened into resolve. "They're not going to help us, Sam," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "We need someone who was there, someone who doesn't work for them anymore." There was a thoughtful pause on the other end of the line. Sam's mind was a library of local history, and Margaret could almost hear the rustle of him flipping through its card catalog. "There's one person who might know something," he said finally, his voice low and cautious. "Arthur Jennings. He was the station master at the depot for 40 years. Started as a yard boy in 1938. If any train went off the official schedule, he would have known about it. He's 93 now, lives over in the old mill district. But Margaret, he doesn't like to talk about the war." Arthur Jennings lived in a small, tidy bungalow crowded with a lifetime of memories. The air inside was warm and smelled of old wood, pipe tobacco, and chicken soup. Every surface was covered in railroad memorabilia, model trains on shelves, framed photographs of steam engines on the walls, a heavy brass lantern sitting on the hearth. Arthur himself was a small, frail man, his body stooped with age, but his eyes, behind thick glasses, were as sharp and clear as blue glass. He sat in a worn armchair, a plaid blanket across his knees, and listened patiently as Margaret, with Sam sitting quietly beside her, laid out her story. She told him about the attic, about the Bible, about her Uncle Walter. When she pulled out the letter, his old, wrinkled hands took it with a surprising steadiness. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently with the words. He read it twice, then a third time. For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his little living room. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had a terrible feeling he was about to politely ask them to leave. "I remember that summer," he said at last, his voice a dry, reedy whisper. 1941, before the real storm hit. The whole country was holding its breath. We were moving a lot of boys, a lot of equipment. Everything was a secret. Orders came down, you followed them, you didn't ask why." He looked at Margaret, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, ancient sadness. "I remember the talk, whispers in the yard, about a train that got rerouted, a train that never made it to where it was supposed to go." A surge of vindication rushed through Margaret, so potent it almost made her dizzy. It was true. She wasn't chasing a ghost. This was real. "What happened to it, Arthur?" she asked, leaning forward, her voice barely audible. "Where did it go?" Arthur's face clouded over. He shook his head slowly. "Orders came down from the top. The company men from headquarters came. We were told to forget what we saw, forget what we heard. A new log was created. The old one disappeared. They told us the official story was the only story. For morale, they said. For the war effort." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his lap. It was clear he would say no more. The wall was back up, built not of lies but of fear and a decades-old loyalty. Margaret's hope began to curdle into despair. She had come so close, only to be met with another locked door. Just as they were standing to leave, thanking him for his time, the telephone on a small end table beside Arthur's chair rang, its shrill old-fashioned bell startling in the quiet room. Arthur picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" "Yes, this is he." His face went pale. He listened for a moment, his already stooped shoulders seeming to shrink even further. He shot a nervous, frightened look at Margaret. "Yes," he said into the receiver. "Yes, I understand." He hung up the phone without another word, his hand lingering on the receiver as if it had burned him. "Who was that?" Sam asked gently. Arthur swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to belong to a young man, not a nonagenarian. "That was Victor Crane," he whispered, "the director of the rail board. He said he heard I might be getting a visit from some folks asking about the old days. He told me to remember my pension. He said some things are best left in the past. That reopening old wounds only causes more pain for the families." The threat was unspoken but crystal clear, a silken garrote tightening around the old man's throat. Victor Crane. The name was new, but the power behind it was ancient and ugly. Margaret felt a hot flash of rage. How dare he? How dare he intimidate this old man, a man who had served his country and his company his entire life? The system wasn't just hiding something, it was actively, viciously protecting its secrets. This wasn't just bureaucracy anymore, this was a living, breathing conspiracy. As Margaret and Sam walked out into the cool afternoon air, a profound sense of defeat settled over her. They were outmatched. She was a retired schoolteacher. Crane was a man who could destroy a person's livelihood with a single phone call. Her quest suddenly felt reckless, naive. Maybe Ethan was right. As she reached her car, Sam placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Don't let him scare you, Margaret," he said, his own quiet anger simmering just below the surface. "He wouldn't have made that call unless he had something to hide. We're getting close." His words were a small comfort, but the fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. Then she heard the shuffling of feet behind her. It was Arthur, standing on his porch, beckoning to her with a frail hand. She walked back, a question in her eyes. He glanced nervously up and down the quiet street, then pressed something small, cold, and heavy into her palm, closing her fingers around it. It was a military dog tag, made of a dull, non-reflective metal. It was grimy with age and earth. "I found it years ago," he whispered, his voice urgent and raspy. "Out by the old spur line, the one that went to Blackwood Mine. I was walking the track like I used to. It was just lying there in the gravel. I kept it. I don't know why. I guess I felt it didn't deserve to be lost." Margaret opened her hand. The metal was cool against her skin. She wiped the dirt away with her thumb, her heart hammering against her ribs. Stamped into the tag were 2 letters and a serial number. W.H. Walter Hale. The air left her lungs in a rush. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring the sight of those 2 simple initials. This was it. Not a story, not a whisper, not a line in a faded letter, but tangible proof. Her Uncle Walter had been there. He had walked on that ground. He had made it that far. It was the highest peak of hope she had reached yet. A moment of pure, electrifying connection to the boy she'd never known. For the first time, he was real. That night, she couldn't sleep. The dog tag sat on her bedside table, a sacred relic. She put it, along with her father's letter, into a small wooden box, a place to keep the fragments of truth she was assembling. It was her evidence. It was her hope. She felt closer than ever to uncovering the real story. But the peace she felt was a fragile, fleeting thing. The following evening, she went out to the detached shed in her backyard to find a sturdier box to store her growing collection of documents. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a deep, starless indigo. As she approached the shed, she saw that the heavy-duty padlock she always kept on the door was gone. The hasp was twisted, bent back at a vicious angle, the wood around it splintered. A wave of icy dread washed over her. Her hands shaking, she pulled the door open. The shed was a chaotic mess. Gardening tools were thrown about, old paint cans were overturned. It was a violation, a desecration of her private space. But it wasn't a random act of vandalism. They hadn't taken the expensive lawnmower or the power tools. Her eyes scanned the shelves, frantic. And then she saw it. The small wooden box where she had placed the letter and the dog tag was gone. They had taken her proof. They had taken her hope. They had taken her uncle a second time. A strangled cry escaped her lips as her son's voice screamed in her head. She had just put a new lock on the back gate that afternoon, a precaution after her meeting with Arthur. Ethan had done it for her, his face tight with a disapproval he was trying hard to hide. "This is getting out of hand, Mom," he had said, testing the heavy lock. "You're making people nervous." She had brushed off his concerns, but now, standing in the ruins of her shed, his words were a terrifying prophecy. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. It was Ethan. "Mom, I'm on my way over. I forgot my work gloves." Her blood ran cold. He was coming here. He was about to walk into this nightmare. "Don't," she tried to say, but her voice was a choked whisper. It was too late. Headlights swept across her driveway. Ethan was already here. When he saw the broken lock and her terrified face, all the color drained from his own. He stormed into the shed, his eyes taking in the destruction, the specific, targeted nature of the theft becoming horrifyingly clear. He turned to her, his face a mask of fear and fury. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "I warned you. I begged you to stop. They know who you are, Mom. They know what you're doing. You have to stop now, before someone gets hurt." Margaret stared at him, the full weight of his words crashing down on her. The shattered lock, the stolen box, it was a message, delivered with brutal clarity. It was Victor Crane's answer. This wasn't about the past anymore. The threat was here, it was now. And it wasn't just meant for her, it was for anyone she loved too. Fear is a cold, creeping thing. It settles in your bones and whispers caution into every decision. After the break-in, fear was a constant, unwelcome guest in Margaret Hale's house. Every creak of the floorboards at night made her heart leap into her throat. The shadow of a tree branch outside her window became a lurking figure. Ethan's furious, terrified words replayed in her mind, a mantra of warning. He had called her every day since, his voice strained with a protective anger she hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Have you called the police? Have you put new locks on the doors? Have you dropped this whole crazy thing yet?" She had filed a police report, a useless formality. The officer had been polite but dismissive, scribbling notes about teenage vandalism and advising her to install a motion sensor light. He hadn't understood the terrifying precision of the theft. They hadn't stolen things of monetary value, they had stolen her story. They had stolen her uncle's name. For a week, Margaret did nothing. The fear won. She stayed inside, tending her garden, grading old papers she had kept from her teaching days, trying to distract herself with the mundane. She tried to convince herself that Ethan was right, that it wasn't worth the risk. She was a 62-year-old widow, not an investigator. Who was she to take on a powerful man like Victor Crane and the shadowy institution he represented? The quest was over, but the silence in her house was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. The ghost of Walter Hale, once a curious whisper, was now a constant, pleading presence. Letting go felt less like a wise retreat and more like a profound betrayal. One morning, as she stared out her kitchen window at the dew-covered grass, she realized the truth. The break-in wasn't just a warning, it was proof. You don't steal meaningless things. You don't go to such lengths to silence a story that isn't true. They had taken her evidence, but in doing so, they had given her something far more powerful: certainty. She called Sam Weller. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a frightened woman. It was calm, measured, and resolute. "They took the letter and the dog tag, Sam." She heard his sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Margaret, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. The fear had burned away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard anger. "But I'm not stopping. They wanted to scare me off. They did the opposite. They showed me how scared they are. We have to go to that tunnel." There was a long silence, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had lost her only ally. She thought he would tell her she was being reckless, just as Ethan had. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet, steely determination that mirrored her own. "I agree," he said simply, "but we do it carefully, we do it right." 2 days later, they were ready. Following the faint pencil line on the old coal company map, they drove Sam's sturdy pickup truck as far as they could up a disused logging road. The last few miles were on foot. They were prepared. Margaret, a practical woman, had insisted on modeling safety. She had called her nosy but reliable next-door neighbor, Mildred, and told her exactly where they were going and what time they expected to be back, instructing her to call the sheriff if she hadn't heard from them by 6 p.m. They each carried a backpack with water, first aid supplies, and a powerful flashlight. Sam also had a pair of walkie-talkies and a sophisticated metal detector. The air in the woods was cool and damp, smelling of pine and wet earth. The path was barely a path at all, just a suggestion of a trail overgrown with 70 years of ferns and saplings. They had to push their way through tangled undergrowth, the silence of the forest broken only by the snap of twigs under their boots and the call of a distant bird. After nearly an hour of strenuous hiking, they found it. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand stone archway. The old railbed was a long, straight scar through the woods, now covered in moss and grass, with the rusted remains of railway ties still visible in places. The tracks themselves were long gone, likely salvaged for the war effort. The bed led them to the base of a steep, rocky hill, and there, almost completely hidden by a curtain of ivy and overgrown bushes, was the mouth of the tunnel. It was a dark, gaping wound in the hillside, a semicircle of cut stone and decaying timber supports. A profound sense of dread and reverence washed over Margaret. This was the place from her father's letter, the last sight of the boys. She could almost hear the rumble of the train, see the steam billowing from the engine, feel the ground shake as 216 young men, her uncle among them, were carried into this black, waiting maw. She imagined her father standing right where she was now, a young soldier watching his brother disappear into the darkness, never knowing it was for the last time. Sam, ever the practical one, was already working. He pulled a heavy-duty brush cutter from his pack and began clearing away the dense foliage from the tunnel's entrance. As the stone arch was revealed, they saw something else. Nailed to one of the thick timber supports just inside the entrance was a faded, weather-beaten board with a single word painted in peeling white letters: condemned. Near the entrance, half buried in the damp soil, something glinted in the dappled sunlight. Margaret knelt down, her fingers digging into the cool earth. She pulled out a rusted, dented object. It was a lantern, a heavy, old-fashioned railway lantern. She wiped away the grime with the sleeve of her jacket. Inside the glass, though cracked, she could see distinct black soot markings. Sam came over and examined it, his eyes widening. "This is a World War II military-issue lantern," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "The markings are from the carbide fuel they used. This was dropped here. This is the place." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air coming from the tunnel. They were not just on the right path. They were standing in the footsteps of the soldiers. She reached out and touched the cold, damp stone of the tunnel entrance, whispering a quiet prayer over the ground, for her uncle and for all the boys who had passed this way. It felt like sacred ground, a forgotten tomb. Her heart was a painful mix of hope and sorrow. Hope, because they were here. Sorrow, because she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that this place was the end of the line. Sam switched on his metal detector, the machine emitting a low, steady hum. He began sweeping it slowly over the ground in front of the tunnel, then just inside the entrance. Nothing but a few stray beeps, likely from old nails or scrap metal. He moved farther in, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the oppressive darkness. Margaret followed, her own light dancing nervously over the damp, curved rock walls. After about 50 feet, the railbed simply ended. The ground in front of them was a jumble of collapsed rock and earth, a cave-in that had completely sealed the tunnel. This was as far as anyone could go. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, lanced through Margaret. Another dead end. They had found the place, but the secret was literally buried under a mountain of rock. Then, as Sam swept the detector over the floor of the tunnel near the rockfall, the machine's steady hum suddenly shrieked into a high-pitched, solid tone. It was a loud, unwavering signal of a massive metallic object directly beneath their feet. Sam's face, illuminated in the glow of their flashlights, was pale with shock. He swept the detector back and forth, and the signal remained constant, covering an area far too large to be a piece of equipment or debris. "Margaret," he said, his voice trembling with the enormity of the discovery. This reading, it's huge. It's long and wide and deep. There's only one thing it can be. Margaret didn't need him to say the words. She knew. Beneath the floor of this tunnel, deep under the earth they were standing on, was a train. Their moment of discovery was shattered by the crack of a breaking branch outside. Both of them froze, their lights instantly extinguished, plunging them into absolute heart-stopping blackness. They stood motionless, listening, their ears straining against the silence of the tunnel. They heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, just outside the tunnel entrance. A long shadow fell across the opening, momentarily blocking the faint light from the woods. Someone was out there. Someone had followed them. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she was sure the sound would give them away. They huddled behind a large rock outcropping, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, followed by the sound of a car door slamming shut and an engine starting up, the noise quickly fading into the distance. Shaking, they crept back to the entrance and peered out. Parked on the logging road, just visible through the trees, was a large, black SUV. As they watched, it pulled away, its tires spitting gravel. Margaret got a clear view of the vehicle as it turned, and for a split second, her eyes met the driver's in the rearview mirror. His face was a mask of cold fury. It was Victor Crane. He had been watching them. He knew they had found the tunnel, and he had driven away without a word, a silent, menacing promise of what was to come. The message was clear. I see you, and I am letting you go, for now. The image of Victor Crane's face in the rearview mirror, cold, impassive, and utterly menacing, was burned into Margaret's memory. The hike back to the truck was a blur of adrenaline and creeping dread. They hadn't just discovered a grave, they had been seen discovering it. The silent surveillance was a more potent threat than any angry phone call or ransacked shed. It was a declaration of power. I know where you are. I can get to you any time I want. I am letting you live. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Every sound from outside her window was the crunch of tires on gravel. Every shadow was the outline of a black SUV. The thrill of discovery had been poisoned by a new, more personal fear. This wasn't just a historical mystery anymore, it was a contemporary conflict. They had kicked the hornet's nest, and now the hornets were swarming. She knew they couldn't go back to the rail company, and the military would be a dead end of classified files and stonewalling. They needed a different angle. The rail line might have been private, but the land it crossed, the mine it led to, that was all part of the county. There had to be a paper trail. Deeds, surveys, safety inspections, something. She called Sam the next morning, her mind clear despite the lack of sleep. He's trying to intimidate us out of the woods, she said, her voice sharp with a teacher's resolve. So, we stop going to the woods. We go to the county clerk's office instead. There have to be municipal records for that mine. Sam, whose quiet nature belied a fierce tenacity, agreed immediately. He knew the system. The problem is, he warned, getting access to 70-year-old land use permits for a defunct mine could take weeks, even months. They'll bury us in paperwork, especially if someone like Crane makes a phone call. But Margaret had an idea. For 40 years she had been a part of this community. She had taught the children of council members, police officers, and county clerks. She hadn't just taught them history. She had taught them responsibility, fairness, and the importance of doing the right thing. She was about to find out if any of those lessons had stuck. The county municipal building was a labyrinth of beige hallways and fluorescent lights. At the records office, behind a tall counter, sat a woman in her late 40s, her face etched with the weariness of a career civil servant. Her nameplate read, Sharon. Margaret recognized her instantly. She had been a quiet, studious girl in her 10th grade history class 30 years ago. Sharon, Margaret said, her voice warm and genuine. My goodness, it's so good to see you. Sharon looked up, her expression guarded, then slowly breaking into a smile of recognition. Mrs. Hale? Wow, I haven't seen you in forever. For a few minutes they made small talk, catching up on life, on children, on the passage of time. Then Margaret leaned in, her voice dropping. She explained what she was looking for, records pertaining to the old Blackwood mine, specifically any geological surveys or closure reports from the early 1940s. Sharon's professional smile faltered. A look of unease crept into her eyes. "The Blackwood site? That's a restricted file, Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "All the archives related to that property were sealed decades ago by court order. Public safety hazard." "I know that's the official story, Sharon," Margaret said, her gaze steady and imploring. "But I have reason to believe something terrible happened out there. Something that's been covered up. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just trying to find the truth for a family that's been waiting 70 years. She saw the conflict in the woman's eyes, the trained obedience to rules versus the innate desire to help a person she respected. Sharon gnawed on her lower lip, glancing nervously over her shoulder toward her manager's office. I could lose my job, Mrs. Hale." Margaret placed a hand on the counter, her touch gentle but firm. "I know," she said softly, "and I would never ask you to do that if it weren't profoundly important. This is about more than just old records. It's about what's right." For a long, agonizing moment, Sharon said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Come back at 5:30, she whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "After everyone's gone for the day, I'll see what I can find." That evening, as dusk settled over the town, Margaret and Sam returned to a side entrance of the municipal building. The door was unlocked, as promised. They found Sharon in the dimly lit records vault, a cavernous room filled with rolling shelves and the musty smell of old paper. She looked pale and nervous, but determined. "You have 30 minutes, she said, handing them a thick, dust-covered ledger. "This is the only thing I could find that wasn't in the sealed boxes. It's an internal acquisitions and transfers log from the old Regional Planning Commission." It was the break they had been praying for. The moment of hope was so intense it felt like a physical warmth spreading through Margaret's chest. This was it, the key, the unlocked door. They opened the ledger on a large table, its pages brittle with age. They scanned the columns of meticulous, handwritten entries, a dry record of land parcels bought and sold. They found the entry for the Blackwood mine property, dated 1952, when the land was officially signed over to the county. And then Margaret saw it. The signature at the bottom of the page, the name of the official who had overseen the transfer and signed off on the final report, a report that conveniently failed to mention the sealed-off tunnel or anything that lay beneath it. The name made the air rush from her lungs. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, a feeling of profound and devastating betrayal. It was a name she knew not just from the town but from her life. It was a name she had trusted for as long as she could remember. Pastor Collins. Pastor John Collins. The gentle, white-haired pastor of the church her family had attended for generations. He had baptized her. He had officiated her wedding. He had presided over her husband's funeral and her father's. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose kindness and moral authority were beyond reproach. And his signature was on the document that had buried her uncle's fate under a mountain of lies and classified records. The feeling of betrayal was so sharp, so personal, it felt like a physical blow. It twisted the story from a fight against a faceless, corrupt institution into something much more intimate and painful. The enemy wasn't just a powerful man in an office tower, it was a trusted friend, a man of God who had looked her in the eyes and comforted her in her grief, all while knowing this terrible secret. That night was the longest of Margaret's life. The discovery felt heavier than the one at the tunnel. Finding the train had been a triumph. Finding the pastor's name felt like a tragedy. How could he? How could a man who preached about truth and light be a part of such a dark and enduring lie? She knew she had to confront him. It was a decision that made her feel physically ill. This wasn't like facing Victor Crane's cold hostility. This was like accusing her own grandfather of a terrible crime. The next morning, she went to the church. She found Pastor Collins in his study, a warm, book-lined room that had always felt like a sanctuary. He greeted her with his customary gentle smile, offering her a cup of tea. But when he saw the look on her face, the smile faded, replaced by a deep, weary sadness, as if he had been expecting this visit for 50 years. She didn't have to say much. She simply opened a file and laid a photocopy of the ledger page on his desk. She watched his face as his eyes fell upon his own youthful, looping signature, A shudder went through his frail body. All the strength seemed to drain out of him, and he sank into his chair, his face in his hands. He began to weep, not with loud, dramatic sobs, but with the silent, shoulder-shaking tears of a man whose soul has been burdened for a lifetime. "I was so young," he finally whispered, his voice choked and broken. "I was just a boy, a chaplain assigned to the rail company, fresh out of seminary. They told me it was my patriotic duty." He told her the story in agonizing detail. He confessed everything. The train hadn't crashed. The floor of the tunnel, which passed directly over a deep, abandoned shaft of the coal mine, had collapsed under the immense weight of the locomotive. The entire train had plunged into the darkness, a catastrophic, unthinkably tragic accident caused by shoddy wartime construction and a rerouting decision made in haste. The company, fearing a national scandal that would cripple wartime morale and public trust in the transport system, had made a cold, calculated decision. They brought in a small, secret team. They dynamited the tunnel entrance, sealing it forever. Then they created the lie. Pastor Collins, the young, impressionable chaplain, had been pressured to sign the official report, the one that said the site was geologically unstable and a public hazard, with no mention of the train. He had been convinced that his silence would spare hundreds of families the horrifying truth and prevent a national panic. He had chosen the lesser of two evils. "I told myself it was an act of mercy," he wept, his face streaked with tears. "But it was a lie. I have lived with the weight of those boys on my conscience every single day since." He stood, his movements slow and pained, and went to a locked safe in the corner of his study. He returned with a thin, leather-bound ledger, the same kind as the one from the records office. "They made me keep this," he said, his hand trembling as he gave it to her. "A private record, just in case it was ever needed. I was supposed to destroy it, but I couldn't." Margaret opened the book. And there they were, the names. 216 of them, meticulously listed, rank by rank. And next to them, the horrifyingly precise designation of their final resting place. Blackwood Mine, Shaft 4. This was it. The final proof. The names of the dead and the exact location of their grave. Margaret felt a soaring, triumphant wave of relief wash over her, so powerful it brought tears to her own eyes. The truth, after 70 years, was finally in her hands. She had won, she had done it. Her victory lasted less than 12 hours. That evening, just as she and Sam were planning their next move, how to get this evidence to the authorities, how to force an excavation, a certified letter was delivered to her door. It was from the County Planning Commission, an official, unceremoniously worded notice. Her application for a land survey permit for the Blackwood Mine area, which she and Sam had quietly filed a week earlier as a preliminary step, had been reviewed, and it had been revoked. The reason cited was a newly commissioned and fast-tracked environmental report identifying extreme and prohibitive safety hazards at the site. The notice was signed by the head of the Planning Commission, and it had been carbon-copied to one individual, Mr. Victor Crane, director of the Regional Rail Board. The message was unmistakable. Crane knew they had the truth. And he was using the full power of the system he controlled to bury it all over again, this time under a mountain not of rock, but of fresh, official, and utterly corrupt paperwork. The door had not been opened. It had simply been replaced by a thicker, stronger one. The revoked permit wasn't just a setback. It was a declaration of war. Victor Crane had moved beyond threats and intimidation into open, bureaucratic warfare. He was using the very systems designed to protect the public to entomb the truth deeper than it already was. The piece of paper in Margaret's hand felt less like a legal notice and more like a sneer. The elation she had felt in Pastor Collins's study, the righteous certainty that had come with holding that ledger of names, evaporated into a cold, impotent rage. They had the truth, the whole horrifying story, but it was worthless if they couldn't get to the proof buried under that mountain. She and Sam sat in her kitchen, the ledger open on the table between them, a sacred text that no one in power would ever read. "He's checkmated us," Sam said, his voice heavy with defeat. "He's wrapped the site in so much red tape we'll never get through. He can commission a dozen environmental reports. He can keep us tied up in court for years." The despair in the room was a tangible thing, a thick, suffocating blanket. Every legal avenue was blocked, every official door was slammed shut and locked from the inside. Margaret stared at the list of names in the ledger, her Uncle Walter's among them. 216 young men, their lives cut short, their memories erased, their final resting place now a pawn in a game of power and reputation, and a slow, dangerous thought began to form in her mind. It was a thought born of desperation and grief, a reckless, foolish idea that went against every instinct she had as a law-abiding, rule-following, 62-year-old retired schoolteacher. If they couldn't get permission to go to the tunnel, then they would go without it. "He's expecting us to fight him in the courts, Sam," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a new, dangerous energy. "He's expecting us to play by his rules. What if we don't?" Sam looked at her, his eyes widening as he understood her implication. "Margaret, no. It's too risky. The site is officially condemned. We'd be trespassing. And after he saw us there, he'll be watching it. It could be a trap. What choice do we have?" She shot back, her frustration boiling over. "Do we just let him win? Do we let those boys lie there in the dark forever because a corrupt man in an expensive suit wrote a memo? No, I can't live with that. I won't." This was a Margaret her son would not have recognized, a Margaret even she barely knew. The patient, methodical teacher had been replaced by a woman pushed to the edge, a woman willing to break the rules for a cause she believed was more important than the rules themselves. It was a reckless, emotional decision, and she knew it. It was a mistake an audience might scream at her for making, yelling at the screen, "Don't go in there!" But her grief for a lost uncle and her fury at a living villain were a potent combination, overriding logic and caution. She was going back. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, they drove back out toward the Blackwood mine. They didn't take Sam's conspicuous pickup truck this time. They used Margaret's old, unremarkable sedan, parking it a mile down the road from the logging trail and hiking the rest of the way in the dark. The woods felt different at night, transformed from a place of quiet discovery into a menacing labyrinth of shadows and unseen things. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep, every hoot of an owl a warning. They moved slowly, guided only by the narrow beams of their flashlights, which they kept pointed at the ground. As they approached the clearing, a cold, hard knot of fear tightened in Margaret's stomach. Sam had been right. This was a trap. Strung between two large pine trees at the entrance to the old railbed was a brand-new bright yellow sign. The words, stenciled in stark black letters, were a clear and present threat. "Danger, unstable ground, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." And beyond the sign, piled haphazardly in front of the tunnel entrance, was a fresh mound of debris, dirt, rocks, and splintered timbers that hadn't been there before. Someone had deliberately made the entrance even more impassable. Victor Crane wasn't just watching. He was actively fortifying the tomb. A wave of utter hopelessness washed over Margaret. They were too late. He had beaten them. He had physically sealed the site. As she stood there, staring at the fresh pile of rock and dirt, her flashlight beam caught something moving near the top of the debris pile. A small cascade of pebbles and dust trickled down the side. And then she heard it. A low, deep groan, the sound of immense pressure shifting somewhere deep inside the earth. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a slight but unmistakable vibration. Before she could even scream a warning, a much larger section of the hillside above the tunnel entrance gave way. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and earth slid down, completely burying the entrance in an avalanche of debris. The force of the slide sent a shockwave of air and dust blasting out of the remaining cracks, knocking them both backward. They fell hard, scrambling away from the collapsing hillside, hearts pounding with terror. For a full minute they lay on the forest floor, gasping for air, their ears ringing as a cloud of choking dust settled around them. They had nearly been buried alive. The near miss, the sheer, visceral terror of it, broke something inside Margaret. She curled into a ball on the cold ground, the flashlight lying beside her, its beam painting a crazy, bouncing circle on the tree canopy above. A dry, racking sob tore from her throat. All the fight, all the anger, all the righteous determination drained out of her, leaving behind only a hollow, aching despair. Her son's voice, once a source of irritation, now sounded like prophecy. Before someone gets hurt, she had been a fool. A reckless, stubborn, sentimental old fool, chasing a 70-year-old ghost, and she had almost gotten herself and her only friend killed. Ethan was right, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Sam, I'm so sorry. He was right all along. This is insane. We have to stop. Sam, his own face pale and smudged with dirt, crawled over to her. He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't say, let's get out of here. He just sat with her in the silence for a moment, letting the terror of what had just happened slowly recede. Then he looked at her, his expression not one of fear or defeat, but of a quiet, renewed resolve she couldn't comprehend. My grandfather was on that train, Margaret, he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. His name was Samuel Weller, just like me. My father never knew him. I only know him from a photograph my grandmother kept on her dresser until the day she died. He was 20 years old. He played the clarinet. He wanted to be a music teacher. He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. This isn't just about your uncle. It's about him, too. It's about all of them. Victor Crane and the men before him, they didn't just bury a train. They stole the futures of 216 men. They stole fathers from their sons and husbands from their wives. This rockslide, he said, gesturing to the impassable mound of earth, this is just more dirt on top of the grave. It doesn't change what's down there. It doesn't change our responsibility to them. He stood up and offered her a hand. In that moment, in the dark and dangerous woods, Margaret felt a profound shift. Her fear, though still present, was overshadowed by the fierce loyalty in Sam's eyes. Her personal quest had become a shared mission. His grief was her grief. His resolve was her resolve. This was no longer just about family duty. It was about a sacred trust between the living and the dead. A bond had been forged between them in the shadow of that collapsed hill, a bond of shared purpose that was stronger than any threat Victor Crane could ever devise. Okay, Sam, she said, her voice hoarse but steady as she took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Okay, what do we do now? The despair was gone, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable determination. Fear had almost beaten her, but the courage of a friend had saved her. And as they walked away from the freshly sealed tomb, they were no longer just two individuals fighting a powerful system. They were a team, and they were just getting started. The rockslide was not an ending, it was a punctuation mark. Victor Crane had made his statement in earth and stone, creating a physical barrier to match his bureaucratic ones. He believed he had won, that he had literally buried the problem for good. What he failed to understand was that he wasn't just fighting a retired schoolteacher's curiosity anymore. He was fighting the combined grief and resolve of two families, a force far more persistent than any corporate agenda. In the days following their near disaster at the tunnel, Margaret and Sam regrouped, not with despair, but with a cold, calculated fury. They couldn't move the mountain Crane had made, so they would have to find a way under it. The mine, Sam said one evening, poring over the old coal company map spread across Margaret's dining table. The tunnel collapse happened over Shaft 4. That means there's another way down. A vertical way. The idea was terrifying and brilliant. Old coal mines were a complex web of vertical shafts used for ventilation, access, and transport. While the main entrances were sealed, these smaller, forgotten shafts might still exist, hidden somewhere in the dense woods. Finding one would be like finding a needle in a haystack, but it was their only chance. Sam's research into the mine's history led them to a small, tight-knit community of retired miners, old men who had spent their lives in the darkness underground. They were a guarded, distrustful bunch, wary of outsiders asking questions about the bad old days. But Sam, with his genuine respect for their history and his quiet, earnest nature, slowly earned their trust. He wasn't some corporate stooge or a government agent. He was the grandson of a lost soldier, a man seeking not profit or blame, but honor. One old miner, a man named Jedediah, with hands like gnarled oak and lungs that rattled when he breathed, finally gave them the clue they needed. He remembered stories his father told, stories of an old ventilation shaft for the Blackwood mine, one that was never properly sealed because it was on a patch of land the company never technically owned. He even drew them a rough map on a napkin, a spiderweb of creeks and ridges leading to a spot he hadn't laid eyes on in 50 years. "It'll be dangerous," the old man warned, his eyes cloudy with memory. "That ground is cursed. A lot of men went into that mine and never came out, even before the army train." With this new map, they found their allies. Two of Jedediah's younger relatives, experienced volunteer miners who worked with the regional cave rescue team, were moved by their story. They were men who understood the sacred duty of bringing the lost home from the dark places of the earth. They had the skills, the equipment, and the courage Margaret and Sam lacked. They agreed to help, not for money, but for the principle of the thing. This small, determined group represented everything Victor Crane stood against: community, integrity, and a respect for the past. This was their moment of hope, a powerful upswing. They weren't alone anymore. They had a team. On a cool, overcast Saturday morning, the small team of 4 assembled near the coordinates from Jedediah's map. After 2 hours of searching the overgrown terrain, one of the younger miners let out a yell. He had found it. The ventilation shaft was little more than a gaping hole in the ground, about 6 feet in diameter, surrounded by a crumbling brick collar, and almost completely obscured by a thicket of thorn bushes. A rusty iron grate, half-eaten by corrosion, lay askew over the opening. It was an unassuming, terrifying portal into the deep earth. Using professional ropes and harnesses, the miners set up a rigging system. Their plan was to lower a high-resolution borehole camera, a specialized piece of equipment with its own powerful light source, down into the shaft to see if it truly connected to the chamber where the train lay. As the younger miner, whose name was Cody, began to carefully feed the thick cable into the darkness, the reality of what they were doing settled upon Margaret. They were peering into a mass grave, a place of sudden, violent death that had been hidden from the world for 70 years. The air grew still and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The camera descended, the depth counter on the monitor spooling out. 50 feet, 100 feet, 150. The images on the small screen were a dizzying, claustrophobic view of the rough-hewn rock walls of the shaft. And then, at 212 feet, the shaft opened into a vast black space. The camera swung wildly for a moment before Cody stabilized it. He switched on the powerful, wide-angle light, and the breath caught in everyone's throat. The light cut through the primordial darkness, illuminating a scene of utter, ghostly stillness. There, directly below them, was the roof of a passenger car. It was intact, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, but undeniably a train car. A thrill of pure, unadulterated triumph surged through Margaret. Her knees went weak, and she gripped Sam's arm for support. Tears streamed down her face, tears of vindication, of sorrow, of overwhelming relief. They had found it. They had the proof. The indisputable, visual proof. Cody carefully maneuvered the camera, panning the light across the scene. They saw not one car, but a row of them, stretching off into the darkness, resting at a slight angle on a bed of earth and rock. It was the whole train, ghostly and silent in its subterranean tomb. And then, the camera's light fell on something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Lying in the dirt beside the tracks was a crushed, rusted object. Cody zoomed in. It was a helmet. A soldier's helmet. And even through the decades of decay, they could still make out the faint, painted insignia of the 10th Infantry Division. It was a moment of supreme emotional victory, the culmination of their entire quest. The feeling was euphoric. They had breached the fortress. They had bypassed Victor Crane's roadblocks and found the undeniable truth. They had what they needed to go public, to force the authorities to act. Margaret and Sam scheduled a press conference for the following Monday morning at the local community hall. They spent all of Sunday preparing, printing copies of Pastor Collins's ledger, compiling their research, and readying the stunning video footage from the camera. Hope was a brilliant, burning sun in Margaret's heart. They were bringing the boys home. She felt an immense sense of peace, believing the fight was nearly over. The emotional peak was dizzying, a feeling of pure, righteous victory. The drop, when it came, was swift and brutal. On Monday morning, an hour before the press conference was set to begin, Sam called her, his voice frantic, laced with a terror she had never heard from him before. "Margaret, you have to call it off," he choked out. "Call off the press conference, now." "What? Sam? What's wrong?" she asked, her own heart beginning to hammer in her chest. "My workshop," he stammered, the words tumbling over each other. "I came in this morning to get the video files, and the place has been wrecked, absolutely destroyed. My tools, my research, it's all gone. But that's not the worst part." His voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "They left a message. They spray-painted it on the wall, Margaret. It says, 'Let the past stay buried,' and they left something on my workbench." "What, Sam?" she begged, her voice trembling. "What did they leave?" There was a long, ragged pause on the other end of the line, and she heard him take a shuddering breath before he could speak. "It was a picture of my daughter," he said, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "A picture of her walking home from school, from yesterday." The threat was no longer about the past. It wasn't about pensions or sealed files or land permits. Victor Crane had crossed a line. He had stopped attacking their mission and started attacking their families. He had threatened an innocent child. The triumphant hope of the morning shattered into shards of pure, cold terror. The choice before Margaret was suddenly an impossible one: expose the truth and potentially put Sam's family in the direct line of fire from a ruthless, cornered man, or bow to his monstrous threat and let 216 soldiers remain lost in the dark forever. The photograph of Sam's daughter was a declaration of monstrous intent. It transformed Victor Crane from a corporate antagonist into something far more primal and terrifying. He was no longer just protecting a company's reputation. He was a cornered animal, willing to threaten the innocent to ensure his own survival. The line had been crossed, and the stakes had been raised from a quest for historical justice to a battle for the safety of the living. Sam's voice over the phone was a raw wire of paternal fear. "We have to cancel, Margaret. I can't risk it. I can't put my family in danger for this." Every instinct in Margaret's body screamed in agreement. Her own son's terrified face flashed in her mind. This was exactly what Ethan had warned her about. This was the precipice she had recklessly walked them all toward. Giving up was the only sane, responsible choice. Protecting Sam's family was more important than honoring the dead. The weight of that decision was crushing, a physical sickness that settled in the pit of her stomach. The victory she had felt just hours before now tasted like poison. But as she stood in her silent living room, the phone pressed to her ear, a different thought, cold and clear, cut through the panic. This was exactly what Crane wanted. He was using their love for their families as a weapon against them. He was counting on their decency, their morality, to make them back down. If they canceled the press conference, he would win. The truth would be reburied, this time forever. And he would know, with absolute certainty, that he could control them, that fear was the key to their silence. He would have won not just the battle but the war. And what would stop him from holding that threat over their heads for the rest of their lives, a silent, menacing promise of what he could do if they ever spoke up again? No, she would not live like that. And she would not ask Sam to. It was in that moment that the final traces of the timid, rule-following teacher burned away, replaced by a warrior. "Don't cancel it, Sam," she said, her voice trembling but hard as steel. "Get your family somewhere safe. Go to the police. Show them the picture. Tell them everything. But we are not canceling this press conference. We are not letting him win with this. We can't." There was a stunned silence on the other end. She could hear his ragged breathing. "Margaret, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her voice rising with a furious, protective energy she didn't know she possessed. "He is a bully and a coward, and the only thing men like him understand is strength. He thinks we're two insignificant, sentimental old fools. He is about to find out how wrong he island. We have to expose him, Sam. It's the only way to make your family safe. We have to bring all of this into the light, right now." This was her most reckless decision yet, a breathtaking gamble that could have ended in unimaginable tragedy. It was a choice born not of logic, but of pure, unadulterated defiance against a truly evil act. She was betting everything on the belief that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that a monster like Crane could not operate in the full glare of public scrutiny. An hour later, Margaret Hale walked into the community hall. The small room was buzzing with a handful of local reporters and a few national stringers who had been intrigued by the press release's vague but dramatic promise of a major historical discovery. She stood at the podium alone, a small gray-haired woman in a simple dress, looking utterly out of place. Her hands trembled as she gripped the sides of the lectern, but her eyes, as they scanned the room, were blazing. Sam was not with her. He was where he needed to be, with his family, filing a police report, taking the first steps to fight back in the light of day. For now, this was Margaret's battle to fight. She began to speak. Her voice at first was quiet, almost hesitant. She told the story from the beginning, the letter in the attic, the family myth of a hero lost at sea. Then her voice grew stronger as she laid out the evidence, the secret map, the falsified records, the intimidation of an old station master, the theft of her uncle's dog tag. She spoke of the condemned tunnel, the rock slide, the men who had helped her, and then she played the video. She turned to the large screen behind her, and the reporters, who had been listening with polite interest, fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The ghostly images from the borehole camera filled the screen, the rusted roof of the train car, the still, silent tomb, the soldier's helmet lying in the 70-year-old dust. A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer a local story about a woman's family history. This was a national tragedy, a wartime secret of staggering proportions. The press conference exploded into a frenzy of questions and flashing cameras. The story was a firestorm. By noon, it was the lead story on every national newswire. By evening, the grainy footage of the helmet was being broadcast on news channels across the country. The weight of 70 years of silence was finally broken, and the truth came roaring into the light. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The rail board was inundated with calls. The Department of Defense was forced to issue a statement. The story of the lost train became a symbol of a generation's sacrifice and a government's shameful secret, and in the center of that storm was Victor Crane. He immediately went on the offensive. He appeared on television that evening, his face a mask of cool, measured authority. He dismissed Margaret's story as a wild and unsubstantiated conspiracy theory concocted by a grieving and confused woman. He portrayed himself as the true guardian of the family's well-being, a responsible leader trying to prevent the desecration of a dangerous and unstable industrial site. He was smooth, professional, and utterly convincing. But then he made his fatal mistake. A reporter, seizing on a detail from Margaret's press conference, asked him why the rail board had fought so hard to keep the site sealed, even going so far as to revoke a routine survey permit. Crane, for the first time, faltered. A flicker of anger, of pure arrogance, broke through his polished facade. He looked directly into the camera, his voice dripping with condescending authority, and uttered the very words he had used to threaten Arthur Jennings in private. "Frankly," he said, "it's because this kind of amateur meddling only reopens old wounds. As I've said before, some sacrifices must stay buried for the greater good." It was a catastrophic slip. The phrase, so callous and dismissive, was a public confession of his true motives. He wasn't protecting public safety, he was protecting a lie. His carefully constructed image shattered in that single, arrogant moment. And then, the floodgates opened. The story didn't just reach the public, it reached other families. An elderly woman in Ohio contacted a news station, her voice trembling. Her grandfather, she said, had been on a troop train in 1941 that had also disappeared. The official story was that his unit had been diverted to a different training camp, and he had died of pneumonia a week later, but his body was never returned. Then, a man from California came forward. His great-uncle, too, had vanished in the summer of '41 from a different regiment. His family told a vague story about a training accident. Within a week, a horrifying new truth began to emerge. Margaret's discovery wasn't the full story. Troop Train 734 was not the only one. Pastor Collins's ledger contained only the names from a single disaster. The scope of the cover-up was far larger, far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. There hadn't been one lost train. There had been three. 3 separate trains, on 3 separate occasions in the summer of 1941, all rerouted down that same unstable, temporary track. 3 catastrophic collapses into the abandoned mine shafts. Over 600 men sacrificed not for the war, but for corporate negligence and bureaucratic panic. The sheer scale of the tragedy and the depth of the deception was a national scandal. The public pressure became an unstoppable force. The rail board's position was no longer tenable. Facing a firestorm of public rage and a dozen impending lawsuits, the board convened an emergency meeting. Victor Crane was forced to resign in disgrace. His reign of intimidation and silence was over. Under the full glare of the national spotlight, the board had no choice. They publicly reversed their position and, in a televised statement, authorized a full, federally supervised recovery operation at the Blackwood mine site. Margaret had won. Standing in her living room, watching the news report, she felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound, weary, and sorrowful sense of justice finally, belatedly being served. The light had won. The truth was out, but the cost had been immense, and the true weight of the tragedy was only just beginning to be understood. The months that followed the press conference were a whirlwind of noise and activity. The Blackwood mine site, once a forgotten scar hidden in the woods, became a sprawling 24-hour operation. Heavy machinery rumbled where there had only been the whisper of wind through pines. Engineers, forensic anthropologists, and soldiers in crisp dress uniforms moved with a solemn, methodical purpose. The national media set up a small city of satellite trucks and broadcast tents, documenting every stage of the painstaking recovery. For Margaret, it was a strange and surreal experience. She, the quiet schoolteacher who had once treasured her anonymity, was now a reluctant public figure. She was lauded as a hero, a tenacious seeker of truth who had refused to be silenced. But she never felt like a hero. She felt like a messenger, a woman who had simply picked up a piece of mail that had been lost for 70 years and had insisted on delivering it to the right address. The victory, as bright and public as it was, felt strangely hollow. The true work was happening now, in the silence of the earth, as the remains of the lost soldiers were brought one by one into the light. The recovery was a slow, arduous process. Shaft 4, where her uncle's train lay, was the first to be excavated. It was a delicate and dangerous operation, a careful deconstruction of a tomb that had been sealed by both time and a conspiracy. Each recovered artifact, a waterlogged diary, a tarnished silver locket with a faded picture inside, a perfectly preserved deck of playing cards, was a heartbreaking testament to a life cut short. The soldiers' remains were handled with the reverence of a sacred rite, their dog tags meticulously catalogued, their journey home finally beginning. A large formal memorial service was held a year after the discovery. It took place on a crisp autumn day under a brilliant blue sky, on a plot of land overlooking the now permanently sealed mine. A gleaming granite wall had been erected, and on it were etched the names of all 648 men who had been lost in the 3 separate disasters. Margaret stood in the crowd, flanked by Sam and his family. Dozens of other families were there, people from all over the country, connected by a shared 70-year-old grief. They were the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the lost soldiers, many of them only now learning the true story of how their loved ones had died. They came to her, one after another, their faces filled with a gratitude that was almost painful to witness. They shook her hand, they hugged her, they showed her faded photographs of the young men whose names were now carved in stone. "Thank you," they said, their voices thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing him home." Each thank you was a small piece of a much larger emotional payoff, the fulfillment of the promise she had made in her father's dusty attic. But every moment of connection was tinged with a deep and profound sadness for the decades of silence, for the lies the families had been told, for the mothers and fathers and wives who had gone to their own graves, never knowing the truth. The ceremony was a dignified, somber affair with military honors, a rifle salute that echoed off the surrounding hills, and the mournful sound of a lone bugler playing taps. Margaret had been given the honor of placing the first memento at the base of the wall. The military had recovered her Uncle Walter's dog tag from the wreckage, and after a painstaking restoration, they had returned it to her. It was no longer the grimy, earth-caked artifact Arthur Jennings had pressed into her hand. It was clean now, the initials WH clear and sharp. As she knelt and placed the small metal tag at the foot of the granite slab, she felt a sense of final, quiet closure. "You're home now," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Her vow was fulfilled. But victory, she was learning, is never clean. It always comes at a cost. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, she saw her son, Ethan, standing alone at the edge of the clearing. He hadn't sat with her during the service. In the year since the story had broken, the rift between them had not healed. It had widened into a silent, painful chasm. She had hoped that the outcome, the justice served, would mend their relationship. She had been wrong. She walked over to him, her heart aching. He was staring at the wall, his expression unreadable. "It's a beautiful memorial," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "They're naming a scholarship after you at the university," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Did you know that?" "Ethan, please," she began, but he cut her off, finally turning to face her. The anger was gone, replaced by something much worse, a deep, unforgiving hurt. "I almost lost you, Mom," he said, his voice low and tight. "More than once. You lied to me. You went behind my back. You put yourself and Sam in incredible danger. For this." He gestured to the wall. "For a ghost? For a story? Was it worth it? Was this worth risking the only family you have left?" His words were a knife in her heart, because she knew on some level that he was right. In her single-minded pursuit of justice for the dead, she had been reckless with the love of the living. She had seen his fear as an obstacle to be overcome, not as the desperate, protective love of a son who couldn't bear another loss. "He's my family too, Ethan," she said, her own voice cracking. "I couldn't let him stay lost." "And what if we had lost you instead?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them, unanswerable. He shook his head, a look of profound sadness on his face. "I'm glad you found what you were looking for, Mom. I truly am. But I can't forgive you for the risks you took. I can't forget how close I came to standing here for you." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone with her public victory and her private devastating loss. The cost of her quest was now agonizingly clear. She had brought one family member home, only to push another one away. The final image of that day was not of the granite memorial or the grateful families. It was of her sons retreating back. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Margaret stood alone, a solitary figure in the midst of her hard-won success. The camera of her memory would linger on the memorial plaque, with her uncle's name finally etched in stone, a testament to the truth uncovered. But then it would pan, slowly, to the silent, brooding mine in the distance, a place where nature was already beginning to reclaim the scars on the land, a quiet reminder that even when the truth is no longer buried, the wounds it leaves behind can take a lifetime to heal.